name's Samantha, and it's good to be here. I'm kind of back in the neighborhood I used to live, like literally a block away. I used to walk past ATA every day, so it's kind of like coming home and away. So it's nice, and it's very glad to be here. Excited to be reading with Erika, and I want to thank her for the twitching facial expressions and the projected film faces, which I think I've been there. Looking forward to hearing more in that piece. So thanks for coming, and so I'm gonna read from a later chapter of Ambient Parking Lot. But to give you a proper context for it, I'm gonna just touch really briefly back and summarize kind of like the beginning part of the book, which opens with the main characters, which is a band of musicians called the Ambient Parkers. They kind of circle around in parking lots in cities and suburbs to record the ambient noise there and make music based on it. As the book begins, they're kind of like just kind of starting up on their career, and not long after they start up, 9/11 happens and the Iraq War begins. And so what happens is they continue circling parking lots in their environment, but increasingly and kind of implicitly, they're also circling around the question of oil, and specifically the reason for the value of oil, which is the automobile. So naturally, them being artists, they they have to respond to the times, and naturally they decide to collaborate with a troupe of performance artists who are kind of doing dance movements, and together they kind of choreograph these kind of strange, morbid, excruciating dances in abandoned cars in an abandoned parking lot. And they do a bunch of these set to noise soundtracks. And one of their collaborations is with a particular dancer who really kind of takes the project far. She gets quite into it, and they kind of collaborate with her. And she does, I think it's like a 16 or 23-hour dance, which inside the chassis of a wrecked automobile, it goes on for a long time. Her movements become more excruciating, more repetitive and mechanical, and really more automotive, you could say, until she dies. But she doesn't really die. Her character dies on stage. But the dancer herself kind of disappears from the book for 100 or so pages, and then quite unexpectedly, the band, the Ambient Parkers, happen to turn on the radio one day, and they hear her. She comes back in the form of a radio interview, and so that's where we pick up here. So this interview is scored for two voices, a radio host and a dancer, but I'm going to read just the dancer's portion, and I'm just going to basically repeat the question of the interview and do some dramatic pauses. Okay. And the name of this chapter is Death of an Automotive Dancer. How did I meet the Ambient Parkers? It's hard to say exactly. I'd been dragged to a couple of their shows by a friend of mine, a budding art collector with lots of free time on his hands and an eye for the down and out. On other occasions, I'd watched them from a distance at the after-parties connected with the performance scene that was happening at the time. The band had become recognizable to me by then, although their features could be described as quite ordinary. As individuals, they could have gone unnoticed in a room full of quirky, vivacious people, chatting, gossiping, flirting, and networking at top speed. All the artsy go-getters with a million projects to finish, a million people to see. By contrast, each member of the Ambient Parkers looked more like a sulky wallflower, crossing the floor alone to the bar, or waiting silently in the restroom line. But standing next to one another, they somehow came together as a group, amassing an identity that you couldn't ignore or deny. I'm not saying that they looked particularly united in purpose. No, quite the opposite. What they shared most was an air of distraction, a sense of foreboding that came through in their restless shifting and quiet shuffling, which contrasted sharply with the frenetic energy around them. How did I come to be at these parties? Oh, I was a competent player on the scene, more or less. I performed my part well, one that might be summarized as girl from the rural Northwest, moves to the big city to study comparative literature, drops out after 5 semesters due to lack of discipline and funds, tries her hand at various jobs like house painting, waiting tables, and palm reading, has a few boyfriends along the way, none very serious or good-looking, but all the decent sort, stumbles upon a group of dancers with an interest in hybrid performance, obsessively attends every show seen advertised or heard about by word of mouth, makes new friends, gets evicted from a teacup studio apartment via the Ellis Act, moves into a ramshackle multi-level Victorian with a cooperative of self-identified artists, discovers that her compact build and early gymnastics training enables her to execute maneuvers that would be physically impossible for the average person, and gradually makes a name for herself as a dancer with an inclination toward the minimalist and conceptual. Would I say that I, unlike the ambient Parkers, fitted at these parties then? Actually, I'd grown somewhat dissatisfied with my role in that community, and the sight of this band of misfits always gave me a burst of hope. I was beginning to feel confined by the part I created for myself, the part I practiced and perfected, and was now expected to perform, day or night, rain or shine, not for my own sake, but for everyone else's. In order to survive, the scene depended on the maintaining of a delicate equilibrium between its participants, a careful balancing act between all kinds of characters and personalities, loyalties and enmities, friends and lovers, scandals and breakups. In this sense, it was no different from any other closed social system. It was a society of mutual patronage, governed by courtly rules and favors. At the height of my participation, I likened it to the Belmont circles that I had read about in the pages of Tolstoy and Proust, a 24-hour salon party hosted in living rooms and venues scattered across the city. Just like in those worlds, the people in my circle could be petty and cruel, caught up in their small jealousies and grudges. It was like high school all over again, high school for adults. Work did come into play, but more as an afterthought. It was 1 part productivity, 3 parts career time. But in momentary flashes, these people could also be grand, capable of rich feelings and expression. They could make amazing things happen because they loved art and believed it had the power to supply what was sorely missing in the world. They believed the ills of life could be improved through creativity, and I believe they were right. I wanted to be a member of that golden club. I wanted to be Pierre, Prince Andre, or Natasha, holding on to my integrity no matter what, refusing to be drowned in the seas of hypocrisy. But in reality, I was at risk of becoming the Duchess de Guermantes, that society woman who showed more concern over a pair of fashionable shoes than the welfare of her sick and dying friend. I played my part well enough. I met and talked to all the right people, accepted all the right invitations. But at the same time, I sensed something misdirected and empty about my actions, as if by working the scene so shamelessly, schmoozing ad nauseum, drumming up audiences for my shows, chasing after the commissions that would keep me in good professional standing, I was also robbing my art of the one true thing that nourished and sustained it. That's honestly how I felt. I was racked with guilt practically every day. The ambient Parkers gave me hope. This is going to sound crazy, but I found myself looking to the ambient Parkers for reassurance and support. At first, I'd catch a glimpse of them by accident, as I peered past my plastic wine glass and over the shoulder of my conversation partner. The band would be milling in the background, and I would feel an immediate sense of relief. Later, I would scan the crowd for their faces, those expressionless pavement faces, and feel disappointed when I failed to locate them. Then the configuration of the room would shift. Some people would move off toward the bar, and others would arrive to take their place. And they would miraculously appear before me, clumped together with their fists closed tightly around photocopied program notes or zines. I'd watch them make their way to the stairwell leading up to the roof, where the most mental types like to congregate and converse, hypothesizing about anything and everything under the sun, lingering by its low cement wall, overlooking a fatal drop to the heart of the city, hanging on by loose threads of talk and perpetually half-finished drinks to the wee hours of morning. As the band swept past me, raising my shoulder in their drab overcoats, I would restart with feelings of affinity and hominess. I would stand a little taller and feel a little brighter, convinced that I was no longer alone in the world. What did I see in them? I had a feeling you'd ask me that. Would it surprise you if I said it was their identification with their source? They had the silliest premise to begin with, as you know. Parking lots, multi-level garages, cars pulling in and out, some vague thesis about the environment, overpopulation, greed. To be honest, I didn't follow these aspects very closely, because I was never that thrilled by their music as music, if you know what I mean. Whenever I listened to it, I was unable to distinguish it from the background sounds I heard every day. It was their relation to their work that moved me, not just their overall stance, but the level of intimacy they maintained with their source materials. At the time, there were all kinds of crazy stories circulating about them. They had made themselves homeless for their art, living for 4 months out of a borrowed station wagon which they parked in a corporate garage, bribing the parking attendants to leave them in peace as they moved the car over to the next marked stall every night, until they had systematically occupied every single space in the garage, a total of 116 spaces, including the disabled spaces and stalls reserved for motorcycles and mopeds. Apparently, they had created nightly recordings for every space, but refused to release the tracks to the public or reproduce them instrumentally during shows because, in their own alleged words, these recordings were meant to be made, not heard. What can you say in the face of such claims? I don't know if any of this was true, but it certainly contributed to the air of mystique that enveloped them. Do you see what I mean? I was moved because they refused to be moved by prevailing cultural currents and social pressures. They didn't budge, and they rarely compromised. They identified so closely with their source that they were totally willing to disappear into it, to become as pavement-faced as their materials, to relinquish their authorship to the asphalt. Naturally, this impressed me because of my own overdependence on the scene. I was always following the latest hype of controversy, never putting anything out there that wasn't guaranteed to win the approval of my peers. I knew plenty of people who understood what they wanted: professional success, minor celebrity, a bevy of admirers, and went about making exactly the kind of art that would secure those rewards. But the ambient Parkers went at it with a totally different approach. They poured all their energies into the art they wanted to make and left it at that. How they came across to others was inconsequential. As you can imagine, this gave them a somewhat aloof, self-absorbed air. Not like some of my friends who pouted and swaggered about in a state of indefinite adolescence, but in the manner of medieval anchorites who willfully sequestered themselves in a devotional forest of parked cars in order to hear. To my mind, the artist they most resembled was Glenn Gould, who famously thought of himself as more a recording artist than a performing artist. I used to listen to Gould's recording of the Goldberg variations regularly, either the youthful, idiosyncratic 1955 version or the later, more introverted 1981 version. As I listened, I recalled Thomas Bernhard's description of Gould in The Loser, and imagined Gould huddled over the keyboard, tucking into those brilliant chords, humming his ghostly overtones, and withdrawing from the world into his music. In Bernhard's words, he sank into himself and looked, quote, first like an animal, then like a cripple, and finally like the sharp-witted, beautiful man that he was, end quote. Seeing the ambient Parkers loitering in the backdrop of these parties, I would feel strangely connected to them through what I had read of Gould's playing. And I would feel in that moment that we were all blessed and protected from harm. Two words would come to mind: conviction and sanctuary. I'm talking, of course, about the Ambient Parkers in the early part of their career, before their big album success, when they were still relatively unknown. They had changed since then, reinvented themselves many times over, and slackened many of their original principles. Before my collaboration with the Ambient Parkers, had I ever spoken with them? Just once. I had a conversation with one of the musicians on her own, apart from the rest of the band. It's a funny story, actually. It happened in the kitchen of a cramped Bayside apartment that had been converted into performance space for an enormous wandering womb. Various symptoms of hysteria were enacted as the uterine mass moved through rooms representing different regions of the allegorical body of woman. A climactic act was expected to transpire when it entered the bedchamber and attached to the brain. I didn't stay long enough to witness that harrowing event, but I did experience the unruly organ in the kitchen or chest cavity, where I stood awestruck with a handful of onlookers as it came sailing toward us like a formidable creature of the sea, all heft in lobe and painted surface. The sculpture had been filled with helium and required the artist's continuous presence to support it, one at each fallopian tube and a third stationed at the rear to help steer and propel it. As the assemblage drew near the kitchen, it appeared placid and subdued, tricking many of us into lowering our guard. Without warning, the previously well-behaved organ went into some kind of fit, shoving several people, including the one Ambient Parker, into my path. She apologized, and we both laughed in spite of ourselves. We talked for maybe 10 minutes, and then drifted off in separate directions. And although her features looked familiar to me, I failed to place her as one of the band until I pointed her out weeks later to my art collector friend, who promptly identified her as the regular bass player. Later, when our groups started working together, we acknowledged a prior encounter with confidential smiles, recalling our fleeting moment of intimacy. By that time, I had forgotten her name, and she may have forgotten mine, but I'm sure she'd agree that these were just details in the overall scheme of things. This is all to say that the Ambient Parkers were anything but total strangers when they approached me and asked if I would like to engage in a piece of experimental torture. Actually, those weren't quite the words they used. They might have said politicized avant-garde or art with critical conscience, but you get the idea. When did I first speak with the Ambient Parkers about our collaboration? The band approached me in the living room of a mutual acquaintance, and I must have hesitated before answering, because a look of shyness and self-protection swept over them. Yes, of course I'd love to, I blurted out, surprised they had read my wishes so clearly. Now it was their turn to be surprised. Have you ever been in a deserted parking lot, just looking for a quiet place to sit and mind your own thoughts, watching the sun dip by slow degrees below the horizon, turning orange, then crimson, then violet, when all of a sudden the overhead lights switch on with a great electrifying thump, drenching the place in a white incandescence? Well, it was like that with the band. When they heard me say yes, their grayish faces flushed and lit up, expressing a tender gratitude I never knew they had in them. At first, I admit I was flattered by their vulnerability, but later, lying awake night after night, it frightened me. It was the beginning of spring, after all, about a year and a half after the surprise attacks that would ultimately lead to a full-blown invasion and occupation on the other side of the world. Some of the artists had quit the scene, channeling their energies into political rallies and protests. Others, like myself, stayed on, holding on to our art with a vice-like grip. In retrospect, none of us knew what we were taking on. In the greater context of life, we were consummate beginners, just kids really. We had a natural group affinity, a natural feel for the group effort that we needed in order to achieve our goals. And in many ways, this camaraderie enlarged and defined us as artists, but in other ways it held us back, causing us to collapse inwardly and regress emotionally. Many people who were part of the scene held themselves aloof from others, and the Ambient Parkers were no different. They invented elaborate distractions to keep themselves busy. They devised painstaking strategies to keep their music spontaneous and unpredictable. In other words, they had fashioned some very effective suits of armor, which insulated and protected them as they went tramping through the parking lots. And like many heavily armored people, they were unusually soft inside, just aching for the chance to reveal the secret part of themselves, the right moment to cast off their defenses and throw themselves open to an experience that they were totally unprepared to handle. Before we move on, can I talk a little about my goals at the time as a dancer? Yeah, sure. For most of my life, I've been vaguely aware of something unreal at the core of my persona. A faulty premise teetering on the verge of collapse. It was something like corruption or neglect, or some insidious combination of these two qualities. And I shared it in common with practically everyone I knew. This was the essential material I was working with in my choreographies. And although my greatest aspiration was to someday punch through these qualities and reach their opposites, the most I could do at the time was to go deeper inside the negative material, to amplify it for my audience and draw it out into plain view. So if at times my dancing looked torturously slow, if at times I appeared to be at a standstill, it was not for a lack, but a surplus of movement. If you watched very closely, you would have seen that I was executing 1,000 tiny movements, each one as quick and elusive as a wind beat. And you would have seen how all these tiny movements added up to a single big movement, an invisible leap of faith, as Kierkegaard might have put it. I lost weight from all the exposure. I became the thinnest dancer imaginable. Given the peculiar nature of my work, it was apparently a struggle just to recognize me. After shows, I'd be approached by people with the most quizzical of expressions on their faces, their eyes blinking rapidly and the corners of their mouths curled up in non-committal half-greetings, which could be tucked away in case I turned out to be not the dancer after all, but a mere lookalike. They would tell me that my body seemed to fade with each new set of movements, that I seemed to disappear altogether at times, and that afterward, they could barely recall what I looked like, in spite of their very vivid impressions of my choreography. These people would also tell me that whereas their bodies seemed to grow warmer and heavier as the performance progressed, mine seemed to grow colder and lighter, causing some to fear for my health. Did I ever fear for my health? No. Well, at least not at the time. Although I suppose my collaboration with ambient partners amounted to a flirtation with death. It was freezing in the cement lot that night, and it took practically everything out of me to sustain the one spark of visceral warmth that I needed to make it through the performance. Perhaps that's all I really wanted, to sustain the temperature of my body, but only just. Were the ambient partners aware of what they were asking of me? After I accepted their offer, we discussed some of the broader details of our collaboration, and they did make a reference to torture. I immediately latched onto the term because it seemed so crucial to our efforts. Torture for who, I ventured? The audience or ourselves? It all depends on who's in the driver's seat, one of them answered without much thought. The others looked uncomfortable, shifting restlessly. Someone, the keyboardist I think, tried to change the subject, but when he realized that I was waiting for a serious answer, he stopped short. It's the nature of my work, you see. I need to know how far we want to take this. Given where we're at right now in history, given the mess our country has gotten itself into, I broke off mid-thought. Are you saying you'd like us to sharpen our ideological stance? Somebody asked. Not exactly, physically shaking. I saw a throw blanket held out before me and I wrapped it around myself. I think it's safe to say that our goal isn't to create an easy way out for the audience, someone finally said, looking out in a circle of nodding heads. After all, we've spent most of our career pushing the boundary between comfort and discomfort. Just look at the response to our work. Half our listeners find our music beautiful. The other half find it grating and insufferable. As a band, we have a love-hate relationship with our source materials. The automobile has propelled us to the place where we're at today. But is this where any of us wanted to end up? We all hung our heads in remorse, but I still needed more from them. I have an idea. It's only a start, and a crude one one at that, I said after some time, looking up to see if anyone would balk in my opening. When no one did, I gathered up the courage to continue. I think we have an opportunity here to take our audience through a scene of extremity. We can construct this scene however you like, but to keep things fair, to ward off our own detachment, we must be prepared to put ourselves on the line. We must be willing to personally undergo the torture that you have in mind. The speaker looked at each band member for a moment before responding. It's a tall order, but if that's what you think is needed for this project, then you can count us in. His words were uttered in a declarative tone that bespoke confidence, but also suggested, at least to my vigilant senses, the raising of a brave front. I didn't question their commitment further. My feelings turned again, as I did so often in those days, to worry and fear. Thank you.